I have often said that American Indians are the open wound in the psyche of America. Uh, Everybody knows what was done to us. Everyone wants to duck their head when it comes up. No, you got to own it. If you want to get past it, you got to own it first. We need to teach it in our history books. None of us go around pointing to our non-Indian neighbors and saying, "You killed my great grandfather," or "You stabbed my father when he went into a whites only bar." But that was done to us. Own it, teach it, then we can get past it.
Welcome back to Cambridge Forum, coming to you live via Zoom. I'm Phillip Martin, your guest moderator for today. As America approaches its 250th anniversary, it provides a perfect opportunity for us to consider the past and uncover some of the stories often overlooked in our national story, especially the Indigenous experience. Now, the harsh truth is that America was built on the backs of both enslaved people and Native peoples, with entire Indigenous nations targeted by campaigns of genocide. Sadly, today's Indigenous communities represent just 1% of the US population, yet their names, images, and traditions are woven into the fabric of American culture, from place names and questionable sports mascots to art and spiritual wisdom. How is it then that the Native presence is so ubiquitous rather, yet unseen, and its collective voice so marginalized? Now, to help us answer this question, we're fortunate to have three guests with us from different tribes. They're going to bring their unique knowledge and firsthand experiences to today's discussion. They'll help us explore the conditions and failed representation of Indigenous people's lives today, and in doing so, construct a more comprehensive and honest view of our American identity. With us today, Lawrence Baca. He's a Pawnee Indian and prominent civil rights attorney who has spent nearly 3 decades in the U.S. Department of Justice championing Native rights, filing more cases for American Indians than any attorney in civil rights history. Today, he continues to lecture nationwide and staunchly defend the justice of Indigenous rights. Rhonda Anderson is a Nupiaq Athabascan. It is from Katuvik, Alaska. She's a powerful voice for Indigenous rights and cultural advocacy and has led discussions on a variety of issues, including Native youth education and wellness, the land back movement, and missing and murdered Indigenous women. She serves as the Commissioner on Indian Affairs for Western Massachusetts and also sits on several state and regional boards in the state. Brad Lopes is an Aquinnah Wampanoag educator who leads efforts to decolonize education and preserve Indigenous culture. As education manager for the Tribal Education Department and outreach coordinator for the Aquinnah Cultural Center, Lopes works within his nation's homelands to promote Wampanoag history and voices. He's a lifelong teacher and advocate. He also serves on various boards dedicated to cultural preservation and environmental stewardship. Now, Brad, let's go back to, let's set the stage. 252 years ago, to the night of December 16th, 1773, that's when a band of American colonists, disguised as Mohawk Indians, boarded British ships and threw 340 chests of tea into Boston Harbor. The tea belonged to the East India Company, and it was a direct protest by the colonists about and against British taxation on tea, and perhaps the first major act of civil unrest which catalyzed the American Revolution. Now, and this is a however, this playing Indians aspect of this protest is often overlooked, the notion of playing Indian, yet it is of profound significance. Perhaps you can give us your version of events through the lens of the Wampanoag tribes who've lived in this region for centuries.
Well, Wuniwanakwami, good evening, everyone. It's a wonderful thing to join you all this afternoon. I think that's a question that's come up before oftentimes, and I think a lot about it. I think within settler colonialism, which is, the structure in which we are currently living in which any settler nation state currently exists within, is deeply, tied to and fascinated by indigenous populations. in many ways, and also using essentially this very symbolism, which again, to harken back to the accounts from the time period, this was essentially a generic stereotype that these colonists were essentially dressing up as. And then, much, kind of after the fact being described as either Mohawk, or if you actually go back, there are several accounts describing it as Narragansett. But there are also the fact that essentially they are just dressed in generic, stereotypical Native American garb during that time period. And I think there's a lot of colonial psychology there because when you look at settler colonialism as a structure, there's a lot of different psychological mechanisms to really process and understand and make sense of what is going on. And oftentimes, I think colonists perceived indigenous people as kind of like these symbols of unfounded wilderness, and freedom in many ways. And oftentimes, I think by embodying that, they were trying to, again, essentially hide their own identities, but also, again, play this kind of stereotypical role and figure in many ways. And so, I think there's a lot of colonial psychology there because whenever we look at settler colonialism, what I have found is that the colonizers tend to be very fascinated by, and at the same time, disgusted by the indigenous population, which, again, they are attempting to replace in every single way, shape, or form. And so, when I think about that moment, I think there's a lot of psychology to unpack. And again, we also have to think back to the Declaration of Independence, where one of the grievances expressed against the king is actually the proclamation that is preventing colonists from actually moving further west across the Appalachian Mountains. And so there are desires by colonists to truly expand in many ways. And so, I think there's so much psychology here that really needs to be unpacked, but ultimately it highlights that settler indigenous relationship in many ways.
And it's really fascinating because Ken Bird's recent series on the American Revolution actually gave us a glimpse into that in extraordinary ways, I think. And from the beginning, white settlers have maintained a strange but just paradoxical fascination with indigenous cultures and ways of life. Now, could you give us some other examples of how this has played out historically? And even today, it's a persistent image, isn't it?
Yeah, in many ways. I think oftentimes that colonizers and settlers have oftentimes loved the concept of us, but not necessarily actually us. And unfortunately, that is something that I think all those that are on this panel probably still experience today. And, whether it is all of this different fascination in terms of our religious or spiritual beliefs or our food practices or our ceremonial practices, whatever it might be, you see these things kind of become appropriated or, kind of piecemealed by settlers and by colonists in many ways, but at the same time, still, kind of targeting those things amongst indigenous people at the same exact time. And so I think this fascination in many ways has really kind of had this moment of picking and choosing of what I'm fascinated by, and then also being completely, disgusted by other portions of these things. And, I think back to the early colonists that came to our homelands and, being in situations in which their housing, even as simple as that, was not adapted for this climate and this environment. But English settlers refused to adopt essentially, climate appropriate housing structures like our ancestors had. And again, that goes back to the fact that when you look at English colonization, especially in places that they will call New England or the Dawnland, they are practicing a form of, or not really practicing, but there's this level of cultural superiority amongst English settlers that oftentimes makes them actually completely opposed to interacting or adopting some indigenous practices.
There's also, and just going to ask you this question, there's also this persistent notion of indigenous people, even among people with good intentions, who view indigenous people as people who have disappeared. Yes, there's genocide, but there was also people fought back and people survived. What happened, if you will, to Wampanoag, Nipmuc, and other tribes who inhabited the Northeast region? How did the new settlers, for example, manage to expand and steal native lands? And was this merely beginning of bigger thefts to come? And what was in the final outcome where were Indigenous people? Where did they land, if you will, in the final analysis and today?
Mm. I think our story is important in this region. I can only speak for really our experience as Wampanoag people. I can't speak for Nipmuc or Narragansett people, although we share similar experiences. And again, just respecting and honoring their stories too. However, I think from the Wampanoag experience, there's a more important event, in my opinion, than the American Revolution that occurs 100 years prior to that, and that is oftentimes understood as King Philip's War. And essentially, when we look at King Philip's War, as many of us might call it, the War for the Dawnland, you are looking at an event within this region that actually radically shifted the relationships held between colonizers and indigenous parties. You're going from a very tense relationship that, yes, it is tense, but there are some aspects of diplomacy going on. However, by about the 1650s, 1660s, what we start to see is so much increased land encroachment because of the amount of actual, you could argue they are refugees actually from England who are fleeing essentially changing political situations going on with the king and different approaches to religious tolerance within England. So between roughly about 1630, 1640, you're seeing actually tens of thousands of English settlers come into Massachusetts Bay and to other parts of our homelands. And that actually is a significant turning point in many ways. I believe that by the 1670s, our communities felt very much so that our lifeways were threatened, our futures were extremely threatened, and this led to conflict. That conflict, oftentimes, people will say it ends in 1676. It does not. It does not formally end until 78 with the Treaty of Casco Bay in the Northern Theater against the Wabanaki Confederacy. And from that moment on, I would argue that our people have been perceived by the province of Massachusetts, later on the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, as essentially wards of the state, and essentially, making us and forcing us at times to adhere to English customs and practices within our communities. Many of our folks were actually enslaved. And for example, if you visit Mass Historical Society, you can easily find in the Winslow paper collection certificates that Josiah Winslow has signed. I've used them recently in some of my research, but they're absolutely heartbreaking because Josiah Winslow is writing a certificate that is signed to all Christian people, and it is saying it is condemning 110 Native people, men, women, and children, actually, explicitly it says, to perpetual servitude and slavery, and that they will be sold to the next Christian prince and that they can find. And this actually is happening August 6th, 1676. And so, these are the moments that I think about a lot. But our folks, our ancestors, my family, all of our families have fought to stay here in our homelands. And one of the reasons why I am extremely thankful for our homelands is because of the natural geography of these places too. But also for our folks that have fought tooth and nail to stay here throughout this time period. We were both Mashpee and Aquinnah. Both of our communities were actually forcibly incorporated in 1870. And I use the word forcibly because there were folks in both communities who actually opposed both enfranchisement as well as incorporation. And did not want to be citizens, did not want to be a part of the Commonwealth. We preferred our own sovereignty and our own spaces.
You bring this up at the most propitious time, of course, when the country's hurtling toward its 250th, most of that in the celebratory tones, without much reflection on this history that you've brought us, Brad, which is an extraordinarily important basis for talking about what is happening at this moment. So we go from King Philip's War to the American Revolution to periods of genocide in the country. Because it wasn't just one genocide, there were periods of genocide. And then we get into the 19th century, the 20th century, and we turned to Lawrence, who at one point was the only American Indian attorney with the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice. And Lawrence, as the first American Indian attorney hired by the Civil Rights Division at the Department of Justice to take on legal issues on behalf of Indigenous people in the United States, what were the main challenges representing the interests of an overlooked, some would say, again, invisible population for many in this country?
Well, it's in fact overcoming that invisibility. Before I dive into that, however, I want to punch home one of Brad's remarks. This is the actual language from the Declaration of Independence about the king and his relationship with Indians. He has excited domestic insurrections among us. He has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers, the merciless Indian savages whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. That's the mindset of the founding fathers when they write the constitutions. All right, we leap forward to the Civil Rights Division. I have what sociologists call a love-hate relationship with the Civil Rights Division at the United States Department of Justice. Number one, using the power of the United States. I always say the 5 most powerful words in civil rights enforcement are, I represent the United States. I got a great deal of deference from courts when I was enforcing civil rights on behalf of anyone. I brought groundbreaking cases on behalf of American Indians, not because I was a super lawyer, but because I represented the United States, and we got that deference. And the United States, when it brings cases, comes down hard and it comes down right. The problem is the division was created in 1957, and over the next 20 years, it brought thousands of cases on behalf of African Americans, but 2 on behalf of American Indians. Then in 1973, following the incidents at the Second Battle of Wounded Knee, the Civil Rights Division found there were a lot of American Indians suffering voting rights violations, housing violations, lending violations. And so the division created the Office of Indian Rights. The focus of the Office of Indian Rights was going to be strictly to bring cases that involved American Indians, and recognizing that there was sometimes an overlap between federal Indian law and federal civil rights law. That unit was assigned 7 lawyers. And it's interesting to see the papers and the news stories when it was created, because they said, oh, well, we're going to go out west. We're going to go to the University of Arizona and the University of New Mexico, and we're going to find American Indian lawyers to work here. And of course, the first American Indian lawyer they found was in 1976 at Harvard Law School. So their stereotype of where Indians go to law school fell on them when I wound up showing up. But of course, one of the distinct problems is it was a group of attorneys, even within that division, who they knew no Indians personally. I was their sum total of friends who were Native American. They worked with Indian people who were always coming to them saying, hey, my rights have been violated, please help me, but no one who sat down at the table and tried to be their equal. When you are the only in an office, and it doesn't matter whether it's only woman, only African American, only American Indian, the only person gets treated differently by the people around you because you are an anomaly in their life. They wind up treating you to the oddest of humor, sometimes insulting, sometimes offensive. But you, as the only, don't have a response because it's your supervisor who is making the joke about you. So you have nothing that you can do except the joke. You go along with it. You have to try and be one of the fellows so that you can survive and hopefully get more Indian people to come into the Department of Justice, so you're no longer the only, and so also you have a cadre of people to associate with. And again, this onlyness is that because you're only, you get the effect harder than you would if there are other Native peoples that you can turn to share the experience. That office was disbanded in 1980. Drew Days said, it'll be better for Indians if we have 225 lawyers bringing Indian cases instead of just 7. The problem is that the division reverted to its previous pattern of not bringing cases on behalf of American Indians. Between 1980 and 1990, my work with Indian people were 10% of my docket. 90% of my cases were with African American, Hispanic, and Asian citizens. 10% of my docket was with American Indians, but that represented 90% of all the work the division was doing with American Indians.
What do you think this was so? You just had in the 70s, for example, the siege at Wounded Knee, the American Indian movement, fighting over very real issues of housing, of land, of you name it, multiple issues. You and they were bringing up issues of civil rights violations that were occurring in Indian country. Why so few cases do you feel were brought by the top brass at the Justice Department post 1980 after reviewing what was clearly massive violations of indigenous rights throughout the country, and with a window into that during the siege at Wounded Knee?
Yes, and in fact, it was a direct result of the siege at Wounded Knee that the Office of Indian Rights was created in recognition of that. The problem post 1980 was all of the people who were in positions of authority at the Department of Justice were people who had cut their teeth on black-white issues. There was a general belief in the minds of all of the supervisors throughout the Civil Rights Division that race discrimination in America was a white man discriminating against a black man, and no other combination fit the bill. And then within that mindset, the division referred to cases involving American Indians as Indian cases. So you had regular cases and you had Indian cases. And Indian cases were then a subset of what the division does as opposed to part of its work in chief. I hold the dubious distinction of being the only racial or ethnic minority in the history of the Civil Rights Division to be called in by a deputy section chief and told, you do too much work with your own race. He said, we think you do too much work with Indians. I said, excuse me, do you ever tell a black lawyer that they do too much work with black people? And before the guy could respond, I said, frankly, do you tell white lawyers that they do too much work with black people? No, you don't. The reality is, I'm the only person in this unit bringing cases involving American Indians. You're not assigning cases involving Indians to them, and sometimes you cut me off from doing Indian cases. Later on that same year, the section chief called me in and said, look, I'd like to get you promoted to grade 15. It's the senior trial attorney status at Department of Justice. But what he said was, I need you to back off of your Indian country work and bring some regular cases so I can get you promoted. That's just an absolute message to me that cases involving my race are not given the same importance by the promotions committee as cases brought by all of us on behalf of other people. You go back to your desk with that.
Yeah, certainly. Let me just turn to both you and Rhonda in this for this question. And Rhonda, we'll start with you. In 1924, the federal government granted, whatever that means, granted citizenship to indigenous people. But tribes, of course, have their own rules, policies, determinations of who is part of the community. Who defines who is or who is not Native? I know that's partly a legal question, and that's why we'll come back to Lawrence. But we'll hear from you first, Rhonda. What's your view?
Thank you very much for the question. It's an honor to be here tonight or this evening. So, Koyana, thank you. I am going to have a hard time answering this, or at least to what you would like to hear.
Or no, whatever you think is the answer, it's fine.
Well, it's complicated. And being from Alaska, I am enrolled several different ways. We are the only race in this country that carries cards that have our ethnicity, not our ethnicity, that has our blood quantum. So we are pedigreed the same as horses and dogs. Only race. And so, generally speaking, most tribal communities are the ones that set the standard, although it also has a federal standard as well, and that is 1/4. So you need to be 1/4, mostly, and you can only enroll in one tribal nation. So this is a process that's going to be a process of elimination down the road. As the world gets smaller and smaller, you could be 3 different tribes on your mother's side, and 3 different tribes on your father's side and be 100% native, but not be able to qualify to enroll in any one of those 6 tribes. That's a problem, and it's an intentional problem, I believe, for the United States government to sidestep their trust responsibilities and treaty rights with tribal citizens. Because
is that like a federal imposition?
Federally, it's the standard is set. I think Lawrence could add more nuance to that. But as I said, it's a little different everywhere. I'm enrolled in organizations that are in Alaska. We have 13 different regional organizations or corporations, I should say. And then all of our tribal villages are considered unique entities or unique tribal entities. However, there's probably only about 7 or so tribal nations within Alaska, but it's seen as over 200 when you look at a map, and that's because each tribal village has different nuances, different complications, different barriers, access. So that's why that's in place, is so that each village can be recognized and be dealt with in their own complexities. So I'm enrolled in a tribal village, which is Kaktovik, Arctic Slope Regional Corporation, Doyon Incorporated. I'm also enrolled through the Bureau of Indian Affairs. So lots of these entities that are both tribal and federal have me listed as a pedigree with my degree of Indian blood or Eskimo blood, according to my papers. So it's definitely a strange thing to be pedigreed.
It's absolutely amazing what you've described. And Lawrence, I have to assume that the very thing that Rhonda described, there were implications of this in terms of rights, in terms of what one's civil rights were, in terms as an Indigenous person, as a Native American in this country, as someone where you are from both from Indian country, as it's called, and part of the broader landscape. What are the implications of this in terms of rights?
First, let's confront this question that all of us, again, who are Native people who go out to talk about race. It starts with, who are you guys? What do you call yourselves? Are you Indians? Are you American Indians? Are you natives? Are you indigenous peoples? And the answer, of course, is yes. We're all of those things. As a personal matter, I use Indian more often than any other because it's in the Constitution, and I consider it our legal name. The Creator made me Pawnee. The Constitution made me an Indian. The Smithsonian Handbook of North American Indians in Volume 4 has a section called The Legal Status of American Indians. And within that, there is a question put, who is an American Indian? And of course, the author confronts the notion that for ethnographic purposes, legal purposes, you might get a different answer. And in fact, for purposes of many federal statutes, the answer of who is an Indian as a matter of law may depend on the question for which, or the purpose for which the question is being asked. But ultimately, Felix Cohen in 1942, a very famous scholar, wrote the Handbook of American Indians and wrote the Federal Indian Law Handbook. And so the author in the Smithsonian Handbook kind of tracked what Cohen had said, that being an American Indian means some of your ancestors were on the continent before the arrival of Columbus. You are recognized in the community where you live as an American Indian. It was added in the Smithsonian, you were recognized by the community where you were born or where you live, recognizing that a lot of us were recognized as Indian in our hometown, but we moved 1,000 miles away and your last name is Baca, so they think you're Mexican, not an American Indian. And then thirdly, the component was you hold yourself out to be an Indian. And this for me then is that social definition I talked about earlier in the discussion beforehand. Bill Paul was president of the American Bar Association. He's an enrolled member of the Choctaw Nation. I met him when I was president of the National Native American Bar Association. He spoke proudly of his Indian heritage. When I said, "Oh, you're the first American Indian president of a non-minority bar," he said, "No, I will not allow the ABA to call me the first American Indian president because I am not an Indian. I am a white man whose great-grandmother was an Indian." I assume for social purposes, when you grow up in Oklahoma, you don't call yourself an Indian in 1950. But 40 years later, when you're president of the ABA, nobody's going to come after you if you do that. But the social stigma attached to being it was still such that Bill said, "I am not an Indian." And so within the definition in the Smithsonian handbook, which for the record I wrote, it recognizes that if you don't hold yourself out to be an Indian, I'm not going to force you to be an Indian. Even though in my mind, Bill Paul with a CDIB card, as was just described by Rhonda, he has a certificate of degree of Indian blood card. He has votes in the tribal elections. But if he doesn't want to be an Indian, I'm not going to make him be an Indian because I know what he faces if he's required to be an Indian. So there are legal definitions where the tribes themselves, Supreme Court has held, have the absolute power to define membership, enrollment, and citizenship in the tribe. But outside of that, then there's the social acceptance issue. My older brother dated a girl, or well, first of all, we get asked all the time when you're mixed race, your mother was white, why are you an Indian? And the answer is because in my formative years in high school, there were girls that I was not allowed to date because I was half Indian. There were no girls I was not allowed to date because I was half white. Society defined me as a mixed race Indian boy, and it did so negatively. My older brother dated a young woman, took her out one time. Her mother found out he was an Indian, and she beat the girl with a soup ladle. She came to school with bruises on her arms from defending herself, bruises on her back and shoulders from being struck multiple times by a soup ladle. That caused myself and both my brothers to say to ourselves, do you like that girl enough to not ask her out? Because you don't know which mother is going to beat their daughter for going out with you.
That's an extraordinary illustration of violence and of the degradation of indigenous people. I want to talk about that in a more specific way with Rhonda. How does this type of this racism, how does it particularly damage indigenous women who have incurred extraordinary damage historically? I know all indigenous people do, but indigenous women have been targeted in ways that that are extraordinary in terms of their disappearance, in terms of their treatment, so on and so forth. Can you talk about that a bit?
Sure. Thank you so much. It's it's a really important question, especially considering as we were starting to talk about the laws and who is and who isn't Indigenous. Indigenous women are really face the highest rates of violence, most often perpetrated by non-Native individuals. And the law states that if it happens on tribal land, then that is through tribal jurisdiction or a federal prosecution. So you cannot do that to a non-Native person. You can't put a non-Native person through tribal system. And most often, it's really challenging, as Lawrence was sort of alluding, getting through a lot of these Indigenous cases. It almost is very hard for these cases to go through federally. One case that did go through was the Jim C. McGirt versus Oklahoma case, where Jim C. McGirt was, I believe he was Seminole Native, and he committed acts, horrific acts, and he claimed
What
that
year,
he was
what year was that?
1997, I believe.
Okay.
And he he was able to get off the charges by saying that his crime was occurred within historic, I believe it was Muskogee tribal nation lands, and so the Supreme Court had to listen to this case, and it ended up that, oh yeah, the Supreme Court said, yep, this is indeed Indigenous land that has never been ceded, and so now you get to either go through federal or tribal courts. So he was tried federally. Um, he was sentenced in federal court for his crimes. But I also I think about that, and I wonder, was he brought into, federal court because he was a Native person? I just have to wonder. Like, I don't hear that very often with, non-Native people that commit crimes against women. It is a loophole, unfortunately, for predators, and they understand that if they go on tribal lands, that there is a really good chance that they're not going to be prosecuted for their crimes.
There's this ambiguous situation where you have tribal lands in terms of protection on those lands, but the notion of someone who is a perpetrator can also claim that it occurred on tribal land, therefore, or off tribal land, therefore, indigenous people have no jurisdiction. Thus, one of the reasons why many Native women have been targeted is your view, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. And I also believe, as we're talking about mainstream society and the images that are really brought up, I, I'm an honest believer that we as Native women have a really difficult time of navigating how we're being represented. This is an image that was done by Tyler Amato during the the No Dakota Access Pipeline movement in Standing Rock in 2016. And the image is of a Native woman who one half of her image is this romanticized princess. Everyone's taking social media pictures of her. She's very stereotypical pan-Indian with a feather headdress and a headband and very light, wispy blonde hair. She's got, these earrings that are like dream catchers and a very Pocahontas costumey kind of outfit on. The other side is who she really is. And that's the reality of our struggles and the violence as we face as Indigenous peoples, upholding our tribal sovereignties and our Indigenous rights. And that is of a young woman. And she's got dark braided hair on one side, and she's being maced in the face. And she's wearing a t-shirt that says No Dakota Access Pipeline. That's the reality that most mainstream America doesn't want to see. And that's a very crucial point to understand, because our women and girls have the highest rates of being murdered or missing. Our women have the highest rates of sexual assault. Our teenagers have the highest rates of suicide. And these are directly related to how we're seen through the school system, through representation in mainstream society. Those myths and those stereotypes create biases that really affect our outcomes. And we, as Native women, are viewed with this exotification, this over sexualization, and we're viewed as something that can be taken and destroyed without consequence. Something very similar to how settlers treat our Mother Earth as well, right? So the oil drilling, the pipeline, the uranium mines, they contribute to our statistics with man camps that are on site and the human trafficking that it brings. And, as our Mother Earth is disrespected, raped, abused, marginalized, so are our Indigenous women. And that's an important thing that is not very often seen. But those images, the images that I showed in that photo, that Pocahontas, those images are not of our making. And when you see images like that and you're constantly hit with a barrage of those images, it can be hard to visualize a future with yourself in it when facing this kind of erasure and violence on your own land.
Rhonda, thank you very much. It's these vile stereotypes are, for a lot of folks, they're cartoon images, but they have real life impact. And Brad, I'm going to make this a little broader. How have you seen those images in terms of how people believe you live, you are, what you represent within the Wampanoag Nation and as a nation, as a peoples? How have stereotypes impacted you and Wampanoag people in your view?
I think every day in every single way. It impacts our kids in schools, it impacts our adults, it impacts our elders, impacts these interactions we have with the non-native public in many ways. If I had a quarter for how many times I have been told directly by a non-native person, I did not realize there were still native people east of the Mississippi, I wouldn't have to work anymore, which, that'd be great. But, besides that, it's really spiritually harming. And when that kind of happens, it's not only harms the spirit, I think it really reverberates like physically throughout my body when I experience that. All of these different kinds of questions and thoughts. And I think one of the things that, really is at the core of a lot of our conversation today, we were talking about it earlier with like blood quantum and things like that, is that I think at the very core of some American thought is essentially eugenics. And when you look at that practice of, essentially what many would call racial science, if you want to argue or call it that, it's not really a science, is at the basis of a lot of early colonial thought and really is at the basis of much American legal practices too. I mean, we're all pretty confidently aware of the fact that even events that occur in Nazi Germany are influenced by American policy towards Native people here. And so, when we think about these kinds of things and these stereotypes, we interact with them all the time. I think about a play that was done in 1829, which occurs only a few years short of Jackson's removal policy period, I believe, or of the
Andrew Jackson.
yeah, the Indian removal policy.
That's right.
And this is when John Augustus Stone wrote the play Metamora, Last of the Wampanoags. And I always kind of laugh at this script and laugh at the concept because he's writing this as literally the state is trying to go around and count how many of us there are in our communities because they are actively trying to determine whether or not we are prepared for civilization, and to be incorporated into the state and elsewhere. And so we are not, there are no last of the Wampanoags. We are still here. However, that play is laden with stereotypes, and all of these different tropes that you see kind of echoed throughout kind of colonial history into today. And there's a reason why I think when you think about American memoryscapes, like how do they understand and remember Indigenous people from, say, the 17th century? There's a reason why, for example, Usamiquan or Massasoit, his statues are from here all the way out to like Utah. But you will not find statues of his son Metacom. And that is because I think there are some that have formed these positive tropes and some that have formed these negative tropes. But also, one of the things to keep in mind is how often these stereotypes and tropes are infused in curriculum and media resources. Even for our kiddos when they're going to schools, one of the things I encourage people to look at is the research of Sarah Shear. She has done significant research on educational standards and how they talk about Native people. And in all 50 states, most references to Native people is in a pre-1900 context. And in most states, basically 90% of the manuscripts written about and used to inform the curriculum or used in the curriculum are not written by Native people. And so what happens when a lot of the echoing, the learning, the stories are actually not you telling the stories?
So such an important question, especially when we are in a period now, perhaps a worse period than we've seen in many decades, of revisionist history, of efforts to rewrite history, sanitize history, and those stereotypes become even more profoundly disturbing. If we're all familiar, Lawrence, with stereotypical images of Native Americans in popular culture and even sport, with teams like the former Redskins, now the Commanders. The current president wants to return the name Redskins to the team in Washington. But now you've collected more than 1,000 advertising examples misrepresenting Native imagery. Can you share how this well-known image of a Native American chief, for example, was used and what it typifies about American pop culture's misrepresentation of Native Americans, as both Rhonda and Brad were just discussing?
Well, absolutely. There are currently probably 1,000 schools in America that have a faux Indian as a mascot for that school. In fact, the high school I went to, graduated in 1968, is still known as the Elkhorn Braves, and they still have this stereotype Indian tall wooden statue in the middle of the campus. What the people who are not having a screen in front of them are looking at, or what people with the screen are looking at, is an advertisement for the Savage Arms rifle company. It's an American Indian male. He's got the classic High Plains bonnet, a very savage-looking fellow, a very grimacing face. He's got war paint, and he's holding a rifle. There were, as you just heard, more than 1,500 pieces in my collection of Indian imagery used to sell products to non-Indians, where the product has absolutely nothing to do with American Indian culture. When we tell people like the Washington Football Club and the schools that are using Indian mascots that this is harmful, this is incorrect, they get defensive. And the first thing they do is develop a story to justify using the image. I find the Savage Arms story one of the most fascinating. First of all, let's start with the notion that Savage Arms was brought into business in the late 1800s. The man who founded the company was Arthur Savage. So this is his name, but he chooses to use an Indian to associate it with the name Savage. So I don't know where along the continuum they were first told this is an offensive image, you should stop using it, but they developed a story. You used to be able to go to the website for Savage Arms, and it told the following story. In 1919, Arthur Savage was approached by Chief Lame Deer of the local tribe in New York. He wanted a special deal with him to get rifles for the reservation at a discounted rate. Arthur said to him, "If you will endorse our rifles, I will sell them to you at a reduced rate." And then, of course, the little story says, and it was at that time that Chief Lame Deer gifted to Arthur the image of the Indian, and it's been used by the company ever since. Okay. Let's talk about the multiple problems with that story. Number one, in 1919, Indians in New York were not allowed to use the courts or vote. The Indian Citizenship Act had not been passed yet. Arthur would have needed to go through the Bureau of Indian Affairs to get an Indian trader license to sell rifles to an Indian. And I just can't see the federal government saying, oh, yes, let's sell rifles to a bunch of Indians that we've confined to an Indian reservation. Number two, and this is very fun. In 1919, Arthur Savage didn't own the company. He didn't live in New York. In fact, he lived here in my hometown in San Diego, and he ran a company called Savage Tires. Number three, the next image you're looking at in black and white is the same image with all the wonderful color. But if you could see in the lower right-hand corner, it says 1905. This is the catalog for the 1905 Savage Arms Armory. 14 years before he met Arthur Savage, or theoretically met Arthur Savage, the company was already using an Indian logo. Lastly, one more image. Again, for those of you who don't have a screen in front of you, there's an advertisement from the Cosmopolitan magazine from 1899. There's a picture of an Indian on the left side. The Savage 308 caliber rifle is the best new rifle in the market. And then the big bold lettering across the top says Savage Rifles, make bad Indians good. There is a statement in America, often thrown around, that the only good Indian is a dead Indian. This advertisement is a play on that. We are the only people in the history of America where a company selling a product has advertised, buy my product, kill those people. But we are then told that Arthur Savage, 20 years later, went to an Indian guy and said, hey, I'll sell you rifles at a discount so you guys can shoot back. I'm skeptical.
You have this, and it would be interesting to talk about progress, and there has been progress, and we'll talk about that. But there's still this dichotomous view of indigenous people, where savagery still plays a role in that perception, to the degree where, like as you said, football teams see themselves that way, when they take on these names, and to the degree where people romanticize their own backgrounds, seeing themselves as half indigenous or third or fourth or whatever, as badges of honor and courage, though they themselves may disparage indigenous people in that in itself is a disparagement by claiming something which you are not. Well, I'd like to hope that we have made some progress in terms of the fight back against these stereotypes and efforts to establish of indigenous rights and to advance indigenous rights in this country, albeit the many difficulties we've seen from things such as Wounded Knee and so on and so forth. And I'm wondering for all of you, now, there are hundreds of distinct native tribes in this country, even with its own their own unique cultures and history. How can we as a nation better honor this rich diversity in contemporary America, starting with you, Rhonda?
Oh, thank you so much. I'm going to be just really quick about this. Listen. Participate in deep listening. We can't do this vital work, right, of social, racial justice without undoing the work of settler colonialism and those resulting systems of oppression, marginalization, invisibility, right? But we need to do this in unity. We all have to do this together, right? So let's just sit down, listen to each other, make those relationships with each other good relationships, not just performative ones or tokenized ones. Talk to Indigenous community members, talk to Indigenous citizens, your tribal nations near you. Reduce that invisibility, lift, support tribal sovereignty and self-determination. Just do that critical work. Just deeply listen what needs to be done. Don't be that savior. Listen to what needs to be done, how you can support Indigenous people already doing this. Thank you.
Brad?
I think honestly, approaching it, I agree with Rhonda in lots of ways. I also think there needs to be truth and reconciliation at a federal level. The United States government has never been held accountable for really, genocide and really settler colonialism in many ways. And the only Truth and Reconciliation Committee I'm familiar with was the one that occurred at a Wabanaki territory concerning the theft of our children. With the Indian Child Welfare Act and even after the fact. And I really think that needs to happen. There needs to be opportunities to listen, to hear, to understand each other as human beings. I think of John Trudell a lot because I think oftentimes people think of me first and foremost as a Wampanoag thing, not even a person. But at the very core, we are human beings. We share things in common. I like to laugh, I like to smile. So does everyone else. I think of things like the Marshall Plan for Tribal Nations, which I believe is out of USET. And this is the concept of, right, the United States federal government invested millions of dollars into Eastern Europe after the conclusion of World War II to prevent the spread of communism, when the United States government has directly decimated tribal nations' well-being, sustenance practices in many ways. And so this is a concept in which, very similar to the Marshall Plan in Eastern Europe, to really be able to restore the well-being of tribal nations, recognize the wrongs that have been done, and hopefully, really change some things. And I think it also begs the question that if this is embodied within the very foundational documents of the US government, then we need to have a conversation and revisit those documents and think anew in many ways. If we are embodied and understood and enshrined in the Declaration of Independence as merciless Indian savages, how can we ever move forward together with that foundation still in place? And so I think that's something critical that we need to really work on as a place. I don't want to say nation necessarily, but as a place.
It's a place. Lawrence.
I have often said that American Indians are the open wound in the psyche of America. Everybody knows what was done to us. Everyone wants to duck their head when it comes up. No, you got to own it. If you want to get past it, you got to own it first. We need to teach it in our history books. None of us go around pointing to our non-Indian neighbors and saying, you killed my great-grandfather, or you stabbed my father when went into a whites-only bar. But that was done to us. Own it, teach it, then we can get past it. Those of us who are still here, we need to stand up and we need to call bullshit. Anytime somebody stands up, anytime some politician says, oh, it was wonderful, the foundationing people in this country crossed the waters and came across American wagon trains and settled the West. They made those sacrifices for us. I fight back and say they didn't do that for us. Remember, they crossed that West on the backs of African slaves. They built that railroad on the back of semi-slave Chinese labor. The settlement of the West included killing us and taking our land. Don't use that language in front of me and expect me to go away quietly. In our schools, we have to teach that it happened. You don't have to make somebody feel bad, but they have to know.
Extraordinary conversation. I appreciate it. I want to mention also that there's a new documentary out that's called Sugarcane, which raises a lot of these issues. This was shown at the Cannes Film Festival, and it's a film about the schools which try to wipe out Indigenous culture and practices. And we didn't get a chance to talk about what's happening in Canada with First Nation people and the recognition of the horror that was visited upon children in these schools, both in Canada, the United States, Australia, of course. And at some point, we will dedicate some time to talk about that as well. I want to thank all of you, Rhonda Anderson, Lawrence Baca, Brad Lopes, for graciously sharing your expertise and ideas with us tonight. Cambridge Forum is made possible through the generosity of Herbert and Dorothy Vedder, the Lowell Institute, the Massachusetts Cultural Council, and you folks who are tuning in. We appreciate it. Thank you all for joining us. I want to thank again Rhonda and Lawrence and Brad. Thank you.
Guyana.